Today in the EU, UN Future Summit hoped to be once-in-a-generation opportunity despite key leaders missing. In New York, world leaders will sit down at the United Nations Summit of the Future today, right before the beginning of the UN General Assembly week. According to its Secretary-General António Guterres, this event is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to restructure the United Nations inner working, starting from the Security Council and the way it currently works. Can this summit change the future of the UN? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today, I'm joined in the studio by Brenda Mofya, head of Oxfam in New York, to discuss the highlights and lowlights of the UN Summit of the Future. Hi, Brenda.
Hi, Giada. Thank you for having me.
So you are the spokesperson for Oxfam at the UN Summit of the Future. From your organization's perspective, what outcomes are you hoping to see out of these 2 days of negotiations?
The Summit of the Future is happening at a time when the world is experiencing a poly crisis. The humanitarian situation, the climate change, the inequality globally is just so unattainable. And we're very excited at our global leaders coming together to make this pact for revival, for ensuring that the UN does deliver the promises that it did of ridding the world of all the horrors of the Second and the First World that we experienced.
The United Nations was born in the aftermath of the Second World War. The world has changed immensely ever since, which prompts for reform of the United Nations. The organization has to evolve with the times. So, what would meaningful reform of the United Nations look like?
The pact itself, for us, is what should be considered as the highlight.
Mm-hmm.
The pact has substantially covered all the areas of reform that are needed around the UN. It has done a great job in terms of prescribing and explaining the situation and the landscape where we find ourselves. It also commits to actionable actions, but unfortunately also it misses out on a number of things. We were hoping as Oxfam that the pact recognizes the need for a distribution of power across board in the UN system.
Yes, precisely because one of the points that I wanted to touch upon is the ongoing friction within the UN Security Council. As far as I know, the calls for distribution of power have been there for a very long time. So, why is reform not happening?
So I'm glad that you're talking about the UN Security Council. On Thursday last week, Oxfam launched a paper, Vetoing Humanity, which is trying to highlight how the failures within the UN Security Council is contributing to some of the crises that we are experiencing, right? So the Summit of the Future has tried to address the reform of the UN Security Council, but unfortunately, again, it has avoided the most important conversations that need to happen within the UN Security Council. In our paper as Oxfam, we raised the fact that the lack of action and the failures of the Security Council to act and the abuse of a tiny minority, the 5 members of the Security Council that have the veto power, the use of the veto power to block decision making and to also monopolize the decision-making negotiations within the UN Security Council has led to a situation where millions of lives are being lost as a result of conflicts that can be prevented or can be handled. And with the situation where we are experiencing redoubling of humanitarian need. In our paper, we look at 23 conflicts, which have cost the world a lot of resources in terms of humanitarian needs. We feel it's about time the global leaders address the issues of the failures of the UN Security Council, including abolishing the veto. we're not only looking at the veto, but we're also looking at the negotiation structure, the ways of working in terms of the pen holding, which again, it's a mechanism that has been designed alongside colonial legacy,
Mm-hmm.
where you find a country holds the pen for a conflict from its former colony. For example, France for DRC.
To take a step back, I think we're giving for granted what this mechanism looks like. Could you briefly explain it?
First of all, for any decision to be made, it has to be supported by the majority. And the majority, 3/4 of the council members, is 9 members. But regardless of whether the 9 members have agreed or not, the UN Charter has also given these 5 permanent members the right to veto. So, whether or not the majority have agreed, any of these 5 members can come and refuse and have a no to a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And with that power, it puts aside any decision of the majority. So, you can have a situation where 14 members out of 15 has agreed, and as we have seen in many cases, including recently with Gaza, and then the US, as a permanent member that has this privilege of a veto, decides not to support the vote and cast its veto, then the
Mm-hmm.
decision can't be passed. But let me just qualify that despite these powers being given to the UN Security Council and the P5, the permanent members that have 5, we've seen that 2 of the permanent members haven't really been using or abusing the veto.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the UK hasn't used that veto since 1989. But for others, such as the US, they've used that veto with a very selfish perspective and not to maintain global peace.
Yes, you're saying the summit is not necessarily going to address this need for change, and yet it's been marketed by the United Nations and its Secretary General as a first in its kind, as a once in a generation opportunity. However, one could argue that it doesn't seem too different from past UN summits whose declarations end up taking dust. Why is this summit significant?
We were told the summit would be a once in a lifetime opportunity for the world to address the crisis, to serve the present and future generations, to be able not only to prescribe the challenges that we're finding ourselves in, but actually to recommit to the past commitments that have been made. You know, the UN has made many decisions and many resolutions, which are gathering dust, right? But we were told the difference with this summit is that it's going to tell us the how.
Mm-hmm.
How are we now going to begin implementing? And unfortunately, in the outcome documents that have come out, we're not seeing that. The how for us, in as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, should have been a Security Council that's inclusive and doesn't just give power to a tiny minority that over the years have used the UN Security Council for their own selfish military interest, to begin asking questions around expansion, effectiveness, and democratization of the UN Security Council, as an example. And we haven't seen that. And it's not only the UN Security Council. The pact itself covers 5 chapters. It covers chapters on
Mm-hmm.
development, on new and emerging challenges, you know, the challenges that we're experiencing in technology, AI. It's also covering a lot on the reform of the international financial architecture. And all across board, we're seeing very watered down language that's not saying anything, that's not putting across the necessary action that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
With this summit, we should have seen action, and we're not seeing it at all.
And so, could you briefly tell us? This, of course, has been discussed and put down in different documents, 3 documents. Which are they?
So there's the Pact for the Future, which is expected to be the main outcome document, and it has 5 chapters. It has a chapter on financing for development. It has another chapter on international peace, the other chapter on technology and science, the other chapter on youth and future generations, and then the last chapter on transforming global governance. So that's the main chapter. That's the main document that's supposed to come out. The other two documents are supposed to be annexed to the pact, and those are a declaration for future generations, and the other one is also on the Global Digital Compact.
And so the adoption of these documents is supposed to build trust. Trust building is a critical part of the UN Summit of the Future. How likely is it that world leaders will leave the summit with greater trust in multilateral cooperation?
The whole summit was supposed to deliver on two things. We have common challenges, and common challenges, as we were reminded by COVID, for example, and other pandemics, including other challenges such as climate change. We are more connected than we sometimes imagine, and that global action and global cooperation is the inevitable. So the promise that we had was for the summit to actually recommit towards that. The second, as you have rightly put it, is that of trust. As much as we have understood that there is need for us to work together and there's need for us to cooperate, unfortunately, we have multilateral institutions that have failed to deliver, which no one is believing in.
For instance,
Be it trade institutions, World Trade Organizations, be it the multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF, they're not delivering. Despite the challenges, we've been talking about the same challenges for the last 80 years, more or less. But, and increasingly, you're finding people, and understandably so, who are saying the UN is just a talking shop. And yet, it's the most important platform that enables us to have collective conversations. This summit has failed to deliver substantially on reviving the trust, given that the actions that we've seen in the pact are not promising that. So we don't know whether the trust building will happen through this process. But at the same time, as citizens and civil society, I think we also have the obligation to continue holding our leaders to task and pushing on it. So we can't give up.
and President von der Leyen will speak at the summit today as well. What do you make of the EU positioning at this summit?
The EU is one of the most important actors or organization in this process. We would have wanted to hear more of a collective position on the UN Security Council and many other proposals that were negotiated within this pact. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that. We've seen individual EU countries, such as Liechtenstein, pushing a little bit further in ensuring that there's revitalization and enhancement of the role of the General Assembly in the maintenance of peace and security, and also pushing on accountability mechanism around even the veto that I talked about. But other than Liechtenstein, we haven't really seen that progressiveness and that push on concrete reforms from the EU. So we still hope that in the implementation phase, there will be an enhanced role of the EU.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada and I. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.